Good evening, everyone. Good evening. And welcome to the Bram and Bluma Appel Salon at the Toronto Public Library. I'm Vickery Bowles, City Librarian at Toronto Public Library, and it's my great pleasure to be welcoming all of you here tonight for a conversation with Premier Kathleen Wynne. This is the kickoff for the library celebration of International Women's Day, and what a perfect guest for our featured event. The public library has been and continues to be a democratizing force in the modern world, supporting literacy and a literate population, free and open access to a diversity of information, ideas, and voices, and intellectual freedom and the protection of personal privacy. And in today's world, we're seeing more and more challenges to these democratic values and principles everywhere. So I think it's very fortunate here we are in Toronto to have an institution as well used and well loved as the Toronto Public Library. Where at the Appel Salon and at our 100 branches in neighborhoods around the city, we can explore issues both as Torontonians and as global citizens, where the brightest and the best from all fields can come together to discuss their work and their ideas, and where a multitude of voices and ideas can be heard. And this is certainly true of tonight's event. I'm absolutely thrilled that we have the opportunity to hear from Premier Kathleen Wynne from within the walls of a public library. And of course, public libraries achieve much of what they do through collaborations and partnerships. And so I want to extend a very special thank you to the Toronto Star, who's partnering with us this evening on tonight's event, as they do with so many events here at the Salon. And now to tonight's very special event. Here's how it's going to unfold. Premier Wynne will give a short talk, followed by a conversation with our host, Toronto Star Managing Editor Jane Davenport. And after that conversation, we'll open up the mic to the audience and we welcome your questions. So let me introduce our two featured guests. Jane Davenport has been managing editor at the Toronto Star from 2012. She oversees all the newsroom operations, including all the news coming out of Queen's Park. She's also worked at the Montreal Gazette and Halifax Daily News. Kathleen Wynne is Ontario's 25th Premier and the first woman to serve in the role. She was first elected She was first elected to the Ontario Legislature in 2003 and became the leader of the Ontario Liberal Party in 2013. She has an extensive political career serving as minister in several portfolios, including municipal affairs and housing, Aboriginal affairs, education, and transportation. She and her partner Jane have lived in North Toronto for more than 25 years, and I have a bit of trivia for you too. Premier Wynne and I actually attended the same high school, and we were there at the same time, where I can say Premier Wynne exhibited such an incredible leadership presence that even then, I well remember her. So please join me together in welcoming Kathleen Wynne.
Thank you. Thank you, Vickery. And we would have gone to the same public library on Wright Street. Absolutely, yeah. So it is, it's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you very much for being here. And I want to just, I want to thank the Public Library and the Toronto Star for creating what feels like a bit of a town square to have an important conversation. So thank you very much to those partners. It's a wonderful opportunity. And I will...
My name is Pauline from Put Food in the Budget, and we're here this evening to ask you, we want you to be our social justice premier.
Yeah.
You stated several occasions you would. We're here to root for you, be our social justice
So I'm just...
Put food in the budget.
Pauline, thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. So, you know, this is a democratic place we live in, and all of our voices need to be heard. So thank you, Pauline, for that. And actually, I'm going to be speaking about some of the issues that I know you're concerned about later on. But I was going to start, as I do, by acknowledging that we're gathering on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, and to acknowledge the First Nations and Métis community that have walked this land for so long. Yeah. And I'm going to make a few remarks. I'm not going to make a long formal speech, because I really want to get to the conversation with Jane, and I want to get to your questions. But I want to talk a little bit about why we are having this conversation still, because even though it is 2016, we're still having this conversation. And it's not as self-evident in some of the aspects of our lives that the fact that it's 2016 has fixed everything. So why is International Women's Day still important? Why do we have to keep having this conversation? And I'm going to refer to some images that I'm carrying with me from some of the things that I've been doing in the last little while. And I'm going to start with some images from my trip to India, the trade mission to India, and it was a wonderful opportunity. We brought back agreements, we made connections in India, and there's so much happening in India that is an opportunity for people who in India are living in poverty, who have a prime minister now who really wants to find ways to change the economy so that it benefits a much broader swath of the population. But there's an enormous amount to do, and the task is almost overwhelming to an outside observer. And so a couple of the images that I am carrying with me. The first one is women sitting on the medians and the sides of the roads, nursing their children, cooking on an open flame, sitting under tarps. And these are people who don't even have the benefit of living in one of the slums, where there actually are four walls and a ceiling, but they're actually living in the open air. And then the second image is of those women in the slums. And I'm saying the women because it was the women and the children who I saw the most of in those situations. That's the group of people that I saw. And so we visited a slum in New Delhi, and I had the opportunity to meet with an NGO who was working with this group was working with women in this community. And what they had done was they had brought the women together, women who had been living very close to one another but hadn't had the opportunity to come together, hadn't had the resources to actually begin to solve problems together. And what this project called ASHA did was it brought women together. They started to solve problems. They put in place some supports for the kids to be studying. There were kids from the community there are kids now going to college, going on to university, because their mothers had the opportunity to work together with some support and start to solve some problems. So that's another image. And then the third one from my trip was a group of politicians, one from Nepal, one from India, one from Pakistan, one from Sri Lanka, and one from Afghanistan, and me, talking about women in politics and women in leadership, and how we can encourage more young women to be involved, how we can encourage women to be involved. And what was interesting about that conversation was that although we come from such radically different places, many of the themes were the same. They were the same themes about the burden of work and how to balance a family and a schedule that a politician would have, how to find, how to get access to the money that was needed to launch a political career, and then how to, once in the political culture, to raise their voices, raise our voices to the point where we could have an impact. So those were some of the conversations that I had when I was in India. And so all of that just reinforces for me that this is such an important conversation. It's an important conversation in Ontario, Canada, and I will come to that, but it's an important conversation outside of our borders as well. And so I think that we are privileged here to have the opportunity to have this conversation in the way that we can. So, you know, right now I'm serving in a government that where there is more than 30% representation of women in the legislature. 30% is a bit of a magic number, whether it's a corporation or whether it's a political entity. Once you get to 30%, what the research shows is that there's a different conversation at the table. And why is that important? That's important because if 50% of the population is not represented at the table, then that's a real challenge. And so what we know is that when we have 30% representation at those tables, at those decision-making tables, then different issues are talked about. So, for example, and I wish Pauline were still here, because what I would say to her is the fact that at our caucus and cabinet table, we had a conversation about the salaries and wages of different groups in our society. And 2 years ago, when we looked at the trajectory of certain groups, certain professional groups in Ontario, we saw that there were some groups that were going straight up, that they had for a number of years had very regular increases. And then there was a group that was right at the bottom of that grid and were not getting increases. And those were personal support workers, they were developmental support workers, and they were early childhood educators. Those lines were going flat along the bottom of the graph. And so we made a decision, the finance minister, the Treasury Board president, and I and our caucus and cabinet made a decision that we were going to invest specifically in those people who delivered those services, most of whom are women. And we were going to put a direct increase into those salaries because it wasn't happening naturally. For whatever reason, their voices in their unions, in their federations, in their workplaces were not carrying, and they were not getting the increases that other groups were. So we made a direct increase on those salaries. That would not have happened. It would not have happened. And I've had members of my caucus and cabinet say it would not have happened if we hadn't had a critical mass of women who said this work is not being recognized and we have to do something about that. So that's the kind of decision, like the decision that we made to put a new policy in place in terms of sexual assault and violence, the It's Never Okay policy, the ad campaign, the changes we were making in legislation in terms of victim services and supports within the justice system. That would not have happened if we hadn't had a big enough group of women who said, this is important, we have to pay attention to this. So that is why it is important that we continue to have this conversation. It's why it's important that we have we've put a policy in place in terms of comply or explain, in terms of corporate boards having more women, more representation. I'll tell you that that's not working. From my perspective, it's not working. I think it's 15% of boards or something has actually increased the number of women and is even approaching 30%. So we're going to have to do something more about that. And in fact, the group Catalyst is going to bring us a report where they're going to be giving us some advice on what more we can do in terms of getting more representation on boards. So you know, we try the nudge and the encouragement. If that doesn't work, then we bring out the hammer, what can I say, to make a difference. I think that there are a number of other issues. There's the wage gap. We've got a working group right now. We're tackling the wage gap. I can't tell you exactly what we're going to do about it, but it exists. It's real. As our Minister of Labour said, you know, whether it's 12% or 35%, whatever it is, no number's a good number, and so we need to figure out how we can once again begin to tackle that wage gap. And then I guess I would just say finally that we're having another theoretical conversation in our society and the society to the south of the border about who's a feminist and who's not a feminist and who should be voting for whom. And you know, I think that one of the things that is very dangerous is if we let those labels and that kind of debate pull us apart. As I've said to folks over the last few days, you know, I'm 62 years old. I've been having this discussion with my mother for 50 years. She doesn't want to call herself a feminist. I always called myself a feminist. Whatever. You know, the point is, what are we doing to make sure that every child in this province, male, female, whatever background children come from, that they see the opportunities, that they see no limit to their opportunities, that they see the possibilities, and they feel free and unconstrained to follow whatever their dream may be. That, for me, is the point, and that's the place that we're not at yet, but that's our goal. That has to be our objective, to get there. And so when people come up to me and say, you know, what's it like to be the first female premier in the province, and I've said this to many people, you may have heard me say it before, what's it like to be the first female premier in the province? I don't know what it's like to be a male premier, so I can't answer that question. I have no way of comparing what it's like. So all I know is that if there are young people who see me in this role and that helps them to imagine themselves in a leadership role, that's great. That is a very good thing. And so I try whenever I can to encourage young people. And mentoring is very, very important. It's a very important part of what we all do as we get into our lives. So I'm going to continue to do that. And I appreciate all of you who are interested in having this debate. It's a very important one. I think that one of the things that we're seeing in the United States is this, and I have heard myself say this a number of times over the years, but I hope I'm saying it now and it's true. The last gasp of some of this really vile sort of misogyny and division. I hope that it's a last gasp. You know, maybe it's not, but we can talk about that. But it's really important that we here do everything we can to create that equitable society that we've been talking about for so long. So I'm just going to quote Canadian hero of mine, Nellie McClung. She said, "The women who have achieved success in the various fields of labor have won the victory for us. But unless we all follow up and press onward, the advantage will be lost. Yesterday's success will not do for today." So we press onward. It's not easy, but it's our responsibility, and I thank you all for being here to press on together. Merci, miigwech.
Good evening, Madam Premier. So I wanted to begin by asking you, you said you're often asked what it's like to be a woman and to be Premier, and I wondered if after 2 years as the leader of a majority government, you just spoke about a number of issues where a critical mass of women in government helped push those issues forward. But I wondered if on a personal level, are there any that stand out for you where you looked at that issue and said, I, as a woman, care about this, and because I'm Premier, I'm going to take this on personally, and it's going to go?
Well, there are a number of those, and I identified a couple of them. I think that we could, I can tell you that in our recent budget, the changes around post-secondary education and tuition, those were issues that are very near and dear to my heart. But there were other women, staff and otherwise, who were pushing very hard to make those changes so that we could ensure that there would be more access to post-secondary education for young people. But I guess the issue that I raised about the sexual assault and violence, and also the missing and murdered Indigenous women. So when I first became Premier, so I've been Premier about 3 years now. You're right, 2 years in a majority government. But in the first year when I was at the Council of the Federation meeting with the other premiers, there actually were 6 women at the table. There were 6 premiers that year. And it was sort of a moment in time, and it was one of those moments where people were saying, oh, do you think this means history's turned a corner and we're going to have a majority or 50-50 female premiers across the country, and I said, don't hold your breath, and now we got 3. But it was a moment, and when we sat with the National Aboriginal leaders that year in 2013, it was very interesting, because it was the year that the National Aboriginal leaders were starting to ramp up the call for a national inquiry on missing and murdered Indigenous women, and I'm pretty convinced that the reason we got all the premiers, one of the reasons we got all the premiers on side, was that we had that group of women who were very strongly asserting that that's something that should happen, that we should throw our voices behind the Aboriginal leaders. So that's an example of where I think having that critical mass of women at the table made a difference.
And does the role that women play at that table as women make a difference? My colleague Tim Harper was just writing about the talks about cap and trade recently, and saying that your role and Rachel Notley's role in that conversation was crucial in gaining some consensus among premiers. And I wondered if you observed that.
Yeah, it's hard to analyze your own behavior, but I think that it does make a difference. We bring different life experience. It doesn't mean that every woman is a conciliator. It doesn't mean that every woman is a facilitator in that way. But I think we bring different life experience. We bring different perspective, and so that helps. It helps the conversation, whatever that conversation is going to be. And I think that on the issue of climate change, it's pretty hard for me to have a conversation about a policy like that without having my grandchildren's face in front of me. It's just, that's my point of reference, is my kids and my grandkids. Not saying that that's not the point of reference for men, but that's my lived experience, is that when I think about climate change, it is about creating jobs, it is about innovation, and it is about there being a planet for my grandchildren to live on, So I think that helps in the conversation. It fleshes it out, and makes it a more rounded conversation.
So I want to come back to the topic of women in politics shortly, but first on the broad topic of feminism that you touched on, which has been in the headlines recently.
Yes, my mother's not in the room, I don't think so.
And you talked about this ongoing debate about whether the term feminist remains relevant, and you actually said maybe what we should all be talking about is what do we need, and I wonder, have we actually moved to a point where the term feminism has become unhelpful?
I hope not. I hope that we're at a point where, if you want to call yourself a feminist, if that word helps, if that notion helps, then I think that should be okay. But it shouldn't mean that we can't have a conversation. I remember a debate we had one year. I went back, when my kids were little, I went back and did a Master's of Education at OISE, and I took some women's studies courses. And I remember having a heated debate about whether marching in certain parades or marching in certain protests made you a feminist, as opposed to what I was doing in North Toronto, which was trying to make education better for my kids. And I had 3 kids at home, and I didn't look like a radical, but the question was, can you be a radical in that setting? And my point is, you can try to change the world from wherever you are. It's the only way it works. If we say that there are only certain activities that qualify you as a feminist, or someone who believes in equality, or someone who is fighting the fight for women to have a voice, then we limit ourselves in terms of the successes that we'll have, and we limit ourselves in terms of the people we can partner with. If I'm only going to talk to people who have marched in certain parades or who have taken part in certain protests, then I'm going to lose the benefit of all of the people who have changed the world from their kitchen tables. So I'm not willing to do that.
So you are often described as a politician who brings a feminist lens to a number of issues, but you've just said it's not a term that you want to feel boxed in.
Well, I've always called myself a feminist, but I think my feminism started when I went to kindergarten and Mrs. Crutcher wouldn't let me play with the big blocks. I was the eldest of 4 girls, and any toy was okay. And I think that through that and through, we weren't able to wear pants to school. Vickery will remember that. We had a big fight at Richmond Hill High School about wearing pants, and our mothers had, my mom wrote a note and said I was allowed to wear pants to school. Okay, so she doesn't call herself a feminist, but she was willing to push on the system to break that rule. So I feel like that has been the story of my life. Feminism, as I got older and I studied, that became a word that I was proud of and I held on to it. But it never stopped me from working with or talking with or partnering with people who had no intention of calling themselves feminists. I just think we have to not be rigid, not be intellectually rigid.
And feminism, well, it's at the center of this vigorous debate south of the border, has had a little bit of an investment in terms of a cool factor recently because of Premier Justin Trudeau. And it's been really interesting to see that it's been a male politician that's taken up that banner and led that charge, less perhaps than female politicians. And I wondered why you think that's the case.
Well, I think that men and women can be feminists. I think that, we're in this together. I think there's a generational issue. I think that was the point when he said 2015. It's 2015 because it's 2015. I think that there's no restriction on who can choose to do the right thing.
So getting away from the term itself, 6 years ago, Michael Jean called for a new focus in Canadian feminism, one that was less about advocating for rights per se and more about changing fundamental attitudes towards women. Do you see that work happening in Canada today?
Yeah, I think it is. I think there are a number of streams of things that are happening. I think that there is work that's happening around. Right, if we talk about that corporate board discussion, we're trying to change attitudes about who can sit at those tables and who has the capacity to take part in those. I'm going to say high level, but I don't really mean it in terms of a hierarchy, but that level of discussion. And at the same time, we're having a conversation in this country about how to value the lives of Aboriginal women to the point where we actually gather the data that we need to, that we have police services work together, that we actually try to put in place the supports to prevent women from getting into those very vulnerable situations in the first place. So I think that changing the fundamental, what was her language? Changing the fundamental attitudes. I think that rather than, those are two examples of work that is ongoing that is targeted exactly at that. Is how do we break the assumptions about who a woman is, what she's capable of, what she's worth, and then there's everything in between.
So picking up on what women are capable of, I wanted to come back to women in politics. You've said that one reason more women don't participate in politics is because it can be a toxic environment, an environment that's created by men, and that this will change only when all politicians learn to foster an environment that works for everybody. Do you think that's possible? What would need to change at Queen's Park day to day, for example?
Well, I think civility is one of the things that is raised as a, that would be a good start. But I also think that that our political bodies also reflect our society. And we live in a very harsh society. You only have to read the comments page or, read the comments on Twitter or Facebook and to know that there's anger and there's viciousness and there's ignorance and there's hatred that has a voice in a way that it probably hasn't had before. It's not that it wasn't there before, it's just that it has different venues to vent than it had before. So the reason I'm saying that is that the tone of debate, I mean, you ask somebody who has been there, my colleague Jim Bradley, who's been there for 30 years, he will tell you that there was a different degree of collegiality, that there was a different tone, there was no television at the legislatures. In other words, there was no media focus on every word that was spoken in the legislature. That may or may not make a difference, but those are changes that have happened. And so we're in a very divisive political environment. And that's certainly, when we look south of the border, incredibly polarized political debate. I think we've escaped that to a somewhat of a degree, but somewhat lesser degree, but still, it's a very polarized, divisive environment. So I think that we would have to all decide that we were going to intentionally change the tone of the debate, and I don't think we all have decided that. I don't think that we've raised that to the level of a serious possibility at this point, and so maybe that's something that we need to tackle.
And could it be self-perpetuating? Could the influx of more women, a critical mass of 30%, if it got to 50%, do you think that would make a difference? In other words, is it men who need to do something differently, or is it a group?
We're at 30% now.
Yeah.
There's more than 30% women in the Ontario legislature now. And I think that, I don't think we can assume that structure and the tone and that is all going to change just because there are going to be more women there. I think that it's possible, but I also think that the tenor of political debate has changed over the last 35 years. And so I think there are two things operating. Yes, you can put a gender analysis on it and you can look at, how that may or may not influence. But we also have to look at what has happened in our political debate, in the political discourse generally, that is creating the kind of vicious polarization that we see here, and to a greater degree, I would say, in the United States.
And thinking of the practical lives of women who are in politics, our federal environment minister, Catherine McKenna, has declared herself off limits from 5:30 to 8 every day, so she can have dinner with her family and stay on top of the kids' homework. She says it's still hard to do this without feeling guilty about not being present for work during that time. How have you managed that balance?
Well, so here's the other reality. Catherine McKenna lives in Ottawa. She's an Ottawa member.
She can cycle to work.
If you live in Vancouver, it doesn't matter whether your BlackBerry's off between 5:30 and 8:30 because your kids are in Vancouver. So that's a different kind of challenge, for people who are elected and have to move to the seat of government. And I will say, I'm very lucky. A, I live in Toronto and the seat of government is in Toronto. B, remember, I wasn't elected until I was 50. I was a school trustee at 47. I was elected to the provincial legislature at 50. So the barriers I had to climb over were the ones that said, you're too old, you're a woman, you're a lesbian, you live in North Toronto. Those were the things that I, so it was less about you've got kids and you're not going to be available, and more about what does a star candidate look like? Who do we want in the party? So there are different barriers. But I do think, and these are related things, because if you are living outside of the seat of government and you want to be part of that level of government, if you can move your children to the capital, fine. But if you don't want to do that and you want to stay connected to your riding, then you have a real challenge in terms of the caregiving. Now, if you've got a partner, male or female, who is going to pick up that load and is going to be that person who will be the caregiver, then that's one thing. If not, then you have a different challenge. And so I don't think we've actually grappled with that. I don't think we've actually grappled with how do we make sure everybody has the opportunity to take part. And especially since there hasn't been a lot of permission for women to have their job, have their family, at the same time and then have their job again or ramp up their job. And, you know, I've often talked about what do those years on a resume look like when a woman has either had to ramp down or made a choice to leave the workforce? What do you put on your resume? Right? And I think we need to really come up with some great language for those years when you're doing everything and you put it on your resume. And there's some recognition of that, because even if you're working full-time and you've got 3 kids or 2 kids or 1 kid, whatever it is, it changes the way you can work, because once those children leave or have, you know, go on in their lives, you can give yourself in a different way to your work. So I just think we haven't got the right language yet, and we don't have institutions that value that work. And the way we know that is that, remember those jobs I talked about at the bottom of the chart? They're all caregiving jobs. They're all jobs looking after sick people or little people, right? So it's not just that caregiving jobs at home aren't valued. We don't value caregiving jobs in the public realm. We just don't. So, you know, that's again another reason why we have to keep having this conversation.
And who should be or could be leading those conversations? I mean, we've talked about politics, but even in the private sphere, how did these conversations start? Well,
we are. We are, you know, it's everybody. I think everybody has to lead those. And I said to the women who I met with in my riding at our women's breakfast on the weekend, I said, you know, whether you're at a kitchen table or whether you're at a board table or whether you are at Tim Hortons talking to friends, wherever you are, I want women to feel safe to tell their story and to speak up and not to be afraid, because it's fear that what I have to say isn't important. Or, you know, I can remember quite clearly, I had 2 master's degrees, I was working part-time, I had my 3 kids, and I would say, I'm just at home. I'm just looking after my kids. You know, just looking after my kids. How can we tolerate that language when, you know, the people who are caring for our youngest and our most fragile are holding our society together? They are, you know, they are the glue. They are what make it all possible. So who should be leading that conversation? Every single one of us, wherever you are.
I want to talk a little bit more specifically about some of the women's issues that you've dealt with as Premier. And you've talked about your plan to stop sexual violence and harassment that you announced last March. And that plan stated very bluntly that we live in a rape culture, and went on to talk about what a rape culture looks like. It's a highly debatable statement to a lot of people, and it might have been easier just to launch the plan from the premise that violence against women is wrong. And I wanted to ask, why was it important to talk about rape culture and not just about violence?
Because see, you remembered it and wrote it down, and it was shocking, so it was important to say it. You know, I think the level of misogyny that we've all dealt with and that we deal with, I say we because we all live in the world, the level of misogyny that exists in the world is still so shocking. And when I sat with a group of students as we were developing the policy, the It's Never Okay, and then the public education campaign, I sat with this group of students and I listened to their stories about what was happening on campuses, and I listened to them talk about how they didn't have access to the tables where the policies were being formed and they weren't being included. And what was shocking to me was that they were the same conversations that I'd had in the 70s. And it was 30 years later and we were still having the same conversation, 30, 40 years later. And so I think that's, for me, why I got you know, I was very exercised about this, and I wanted to make it clear that what had gone on with some of the high-profile people, you know, the Jian Ghomeshi, the Bill Cosby, that moment, we had to use it. We had to use that moment to make it clear that our time was up on this. We had to make a change. And so that's why we brought the policy in, and we worked very quickly. You know, we worked for a very few months, not to have a whole new consultation, but to actually gather from across ministries the policies that people knew, the experts knew were important, the things we knew we needed to do, but just there hadn't been the political will to do them, and then take the next steps. And some of the next steps are things like human trafficking. We haven't had a conversation about human trafficking in this country. We don't act, certainly in this province, we don't act as though it is a problem in this province. And it is a problem. We've got to be better about it, and we've got to do it quickly. So, you know, the policies we brought in, that was the first step, and now we know that there's more to be done.
We were just talking about attitudes in this province, and I wanted to go back to your 2014 campaign.
Right.
Because to me, one of the things that stood out about that campaign was your conviction that the fact that you're gay would not be an issue for Ontarians, and you're proven spectacularly right. And I wanted to ask, how did you know?
So I have to go back to my leadership campaign, because when I started to tell people that I was going to run for the leadership, there were people within the party, many people within the party, who said, you know, we like you, but you can't win. You might even be able to win the leadership, but you can't win an election.
Because of North Toronto.
Because you're a lesbian. Because you, well, I mean, it came down to because you're a lesbian. That was really the nub of it. People would dance around because people don't like that word. So there was like, you know, you're too urban. Okay. Because everybody in the cities is gay. I don't know. You're too urban, you're too whatever. But it came down to you're too lesbian, so you can't win. And so I said in my speech in the leadership that I didn't believe that about Ontarians. I didn't believe that would be the deciding factor. And I put it on the table in my leadership because I wanted it to be crystal clear to everyone in the party that that was my position, that I didn't believe that was what was going to decide the issue for Ontarians. And every election campaign, whether it was the leadership or every campaign I've gone into, I've gone in with my whole heart, always with a plan B, because you can lose in these things, you know. I lost my first election when I ran for school trustee, and you have to be prepared to lose. And the way that frees one, if you're prepared to lose, you're prepared to put your whole self on the table and let everyone make their judgments. So in my leadership speech, I put it out to the party and said, I can take this on, and I believe that the people of Ontario will be fair, and they will make their judgments based on our policies, based on our enthusiasm, based on our beliefs, based on our commitment to create jobs for their kids. That's what they'll be looking for, and we were right.
So to keep moving forward as an inclusive society, what work do Ontarians have left to do?
Well, I think we have work in every school, every boardroom, in every institution where there isn't an intentional decision to include all the voices at the table. And we're talking about women tonight, but I think we have to go broader than that. We have to talk about all of our diversity, you know. So I think it has to be very intentional. I think we need to train ourselves. You know, I think we make assumptions. We make assumptions because it's 2016 that somehow we're past it. Somehow we all know about being inclusive, that you know, we haven't internalized sexism, or we haven't internalized homophobia or racism. We haven't done any of that. And that's just not true. We have internalized all of those things, and we have to deal with them in ourselves and in our organizations, which is why, you know, we're doing training in our own caucus and in our own government on all of those issues. So it's why we're putting the issues around racism and First Nations and Aboriginal people on the front burner in terms of setting up an anti-racism directorate to say once again, this work's not finished. So we have to be very intentional. We have to relearn. We have to educate ourselves about where our assumptions have led us down the wrong paths, and then we need to take action.
So you were speaking earlier when discussing issues of climate change. It's very hard for you to do that without having the faces of your grandchildren at the forefront of your mind. And I was struck at the end of a speech that you gave on December 6th this past year, and you were speaking to the children in the room a little bit at the end and saying that your plan to end violence against women was part of your wish to build a safer world for our children, for Ontario's children. And I wanted to ask you in closing, thinking about your own grandchildren, what's the value you would most hope for them to embrace as they grow into adults?
The value? Oh, there's so many. I mean, the first one that comes to mind is honesty, and that encompasses a whole lot of things. As it happens, my grandchildren are First Nation and boys and girls, so they're the whole basket. So I want them to be fearless, and I want them to value themselves. I want them to be, I want them to know who they are, and I want them to feel safe to be everything that they can be. That's what I want for them, and for every child. There's
a lineup at the microphone.
There is a lineup.
I want to thank you very much for your time tonight. I've learned a lot.
Thank you.
I'm sure our audience has. We'll go to questions.
Hello, and first off, thank you so much, Premier Wynne, for talking about the importance of women in politics and equal representation in government. My name is Jennifer, and I'm a part of the Toronto Women's City Alliance. We've been working towards establishing a Women's Equalities Office here in our City Hall because we believe that, yes, women in politics and representation across all genders and identities is important, but also using a gender-based analysis when approaching economic and social policies.
Mm-hmm.
So if that's what we're doing towards the city, and that's what we're trying to advocate for, can you tell us more about what Ontario is doing and if Ontario is using that approach when making policies for everyone else?
Yes, so we have already in place an Ontario Women's Directorate, and the role, one of the roles of the Ontario Women's Directorate is to bring that lens to the table, is to look at policies as they come forward and to provide input and feedback on what the impact will be on women. And in fact, that is what our Minister Tracy McCharles does. We also have had in our government a women's caucus, and from time to time that has been across party lines. It doesn't always work that way, but we've had a women's caucus that has helped us in government to look at the policies. And I'll give you a good example. When we were first in government, we had a women's caucus when Premier McGuinty was in office, and we had not run, in 2003, we had not run on a platform that really included tackling poverty in so many words. You know, we had not said that poverty reduction is a goal of ours. And it was the Women's Caucus who brought poverty to the table as an economic issue, as an issue that was important to all aspects of government, to all our ministries, that we needed to have that lens, and so that's how we ended up having a poverty reduction strategy with targets that we actually have to report on. So we've tried both in legislation and in terms of our policy development processes to have that lens that is driven by women in the first instance applied.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Hi, Premier Wynne. I'm from Daily Extra Gay and Lesbian News, and I was just wondering, I know that in terms of employment and the wage gap, that it's around 35% between men and women. But I also know that studies show that that number becomes even worse when we talk about women of color and gay women, and then it can be even worse for transgender women. Do you have any ideas about how the Ontario government can help all diverse kinds of women overcome those unique hurdles?
Well, that's why we've put together a working group on the wage gap, because we need to look at that whole issue. It's not just one group of women we're talking about. We have to look across at different groups of women, because when you layer those realities, you're right, it gets worse. So that's one of the reasons that this is so important. And you know, if you look again look at those groups that I talked about, the personal support workers, developmental support workers, and early childhood educators, there's a disproportionate representation of women from diverse backgrounds in those workplaces as well. So as we have this conversation, that becomes one aspect of it.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, Kathleen. My name is Sarah LaBelle. I'm an executive board member with the Ontario Public Service Employees Union, and I'm a very proud public servant. I work in healthcare, where the sector is 85% female. We represent members in developmental services, PSWs, in the areas that you mentioned, ECEs, and they are being disproportionately impacted by budget decisions by this government. And you spoke to divisiveness that we see happening in politics, and it's happening in the States. But I think government plays a really big role in stopping that divisiveness by not pitting private sector against public sector, by saying that our public sector workers, who we respect and who do great work, deserve a good wage because they are women. And there are areas in the public sector where we have achieved parity with men. We've achieved equality, and these constant decisions that are coming from the past few budgets, rounds of budgets, are not helping the public sector any, and we are falling behind. So I just would really like to appeal to you with the whole gender wage gap, with that working group, that you take a real look at what your role is as government in helping to keep women where they are as well.
So I appreciate that, and you know, in terms of healthcare, education, in terms of social services, we continue to increase our budgets. We continue to make more investments in those areas, and as I said, some very targeted investments, because we recognize that as we go through a transformation in healthcare, for example, as we move more care into the community, because that's what people are asking for. People, as we have more people aging, they want care at home, they want those supports. So we know that personal support workers, for example, are increasingly going to be important to the healthcare system. So I guess I reject the premise that we are cutting across government just because we're not. I mean, that's just not the case. We're actually increasing budgets in every single one of those areas, and targeting some of those increases in those most vulnerable areas. So we can have a debate about
But the
about
layoffs are telling you different.
Well, but you know, the whole story in terms of the changes, and if you're talking about the healthcare system, you know, when the opposition stands up in the House and they talk about changes in the healthcare system and they use cuts, they don't talk about the hiring. They don't talk about where people are being hired. They don't talk about where there's an increase. They don't talk about where job postings are actually increasing. So you have to look at the whole story, and you have to look at across the system the millions of dollars more that are being invested in our social services and in healthcare and education.
Well, I work in healthcare, and I'm telling you that's not happening. That's
okay. Well, again, we have to look at the whole system, and I appreciate your perspective, and I would love to hear the specific examples. Okay. Yeah.
Hi, I appreciate this opportunity. This is a wonderful evening. My name is Karen, and I'm a member of the United Church-related United Network for a Just Peace. People who lived through apartheid, the worst of apartheid in South Africa, claim that the situation for Palestinians is far worse than what they ever experienced in South Africa. Would you have visited South Africa at a time when people were trying to work for justice by enforcing BDS on South Africa?
So I'm also a member of the United Church of Canada, and I'm not going to wade into an international debate right now. I just, it's, from my perspective, what we need to do across our own province, country, across the globe, is to do everything in our power to fight for equality, to help people to live decent lives, to do everything within our power. It's not within my power to intervene in those situations, and so I know that there's a debate even within the United Church about some of those issues. They're very, very contentious, and they're very, very deep-rooted conflicts, and so I'm going to stay within my sphere of influence in terms of trying to fight for a more equal and just world.
I would say silence is complicity.
I just wanted to say, first off, I'm a tad bit nervous, but I wanted to say thank you for the work that you're doing in against sexual assault. I hope we can live in a world where no woman is afraid to bring their rapist to justice like I was. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I wanted to ask you, and it's probably a nice question, but it might be a bit of a personal one. You're fighting a lot of things, and people are asking you to be perfect because you are the first woman in this position. What do you do to take care of yourself?
Such a nice question. Thank you. It's a great question because it's a challenge. It's a challenge. The thing that I do that's the most important is to try to stay healthy, physically healthy. It's not something that we, I think, give enough credence to, enough value to, and so making time for exercise, making time to run, for me is critical. To be outside, we sit way too much. We've become this sedentary, screen-based society, so it's hard. So exercise and those grandchildren and children I talked about. My parents are in their 80s. My dad's going to be 90. Trying to stay connected to them. That's what grounds me. And so having those connections is really, really important to me. And I haven't figured it out yet, all of it. So
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for asking.
Hi, I'm Laura. There's been a lot of mention about the closing the gender wage gap and the consultations that happened across the province.
Yes.
My concern is the recommendations. When can we expect for the recommendations to be released? And also, what commitment is this government ready to make to enact those recommendations, especially since a lot of those recommendations are going to be centered around things that we're already aware of, like if we increase affordable, accessible childcare, the minimum wage, access to collective bargaining. All of those are steps to close the gender wage gap. Thank you.
Yeah. So I honestly haven't seen the recommendations yet. I hope I will see them soon. I don't know is Carolyn here? Do we have a time frame on recommendations? Spring. So that's soon. That's today. It was spring today. So I assume they'll be on my desk when I get back. We will see them soon. And you're right. There will be recommendations that will refer to things that we know about, and I will do my very best to take action where we can and continue to work with people. I know there are people in this room who have worked on these files for years and years and years, and I appreciate that. I wanted to put this back on the radar. I wanted us to take another shot at it, and so that's what we're doing. I will do my very best to move the bar.
Hi, I'm from Don Valley East, the riding Don Valley East, and I'd like to ask if in the next cabinet or cabinet shuffle, will you commit, like our Prime Minister, to have a 50% woman cabinet?
I'd love to do that. It's something that I think was commendable. It's a matter when you make a cabinet. There are a whole lot of things that you have to take into account. I have a caucus of 59 people. You take away one for the speaker, so I have 58 people in my cabinet, in my caucus. My cabinet is about half of that number, roughly. So it's a challenge in terms of having to have regional representation, gender representation, skills base. So in my heart, I would love to make that commitment, and it's something I've struggled with. I just can't make that promise because I'm not sure I can live up to it because of all those other constraints. I'm being perfectly honest with you. But it's not because I don't believe in it. Now, if I had 85 members out of 107, so maybe in the next election, but it's certainly something that I aspire to, and I appreciate you raising it, and you need to continue asking that question because it's important.
All right, thank you.
2 more questions?
Again, thank you so much for your speech this evening. You began by talking about your recent trip to India, and I was wondering, how do you see Ontario's role on the global stage in economic capacities as well as in terms of gender and women's rights?
So in terms of the economy, and I don't necessarily separate all these things, they're all connected, because our economy will be stronger if we've got everybody at their very best, and we've got all the best voices at the table, and 50% of those are women, so the economy will be stronger. But in terms of the economy, I was struck when I was in India how much we have to offer and gain from partnerships. Even just on water and clean air, the technologies that are being developed here in Ontario, we have huge opportunities, and I had clean tech companies with me when we traveled to India, and there are partnerships that will develop because of that trip that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Then that will support the work that Prime Minister Modi is doing to try to create a cleaner environment in India as well. So we've got a lot to offer, and that in turn benefits us here in Ontario because we create jobs and we have stronger companies here. So there's a real connection between the prosperity of Canada and other parts of the world. So that's that piece. In terms of the role that we have to play in terms of women and women's rights and women's voice, I think we have a responsibility because of our privilege, because of our relative affluence and the possibilities here in this country, and because we have such a strong healthcare system, a strong education system, that we have a responsibility to be at our very best. We have a responsibility to push ourselves to be that model that I talk about us having the capacity to be a model for the world in terms of our diversity and our strength. So I think that's our responsibility, to do everything in our power because we can. We have such capacity. And so, we're a small population in this beautiful geography. And so we have the ability to really shine a light on how to be more equitable, a more just society, and that's our responsibility.
Thank you.
It's just 3 more people. So do you want
us to go through the last couple?
Yeah, if we just go quickly, the 4 people who are standing there, we can hear their questions, but nobody else can stand up at the mic now, okay? Yeah, we'll get your questions. Oh, no, you mean then I have to remember them.
Yeah. We know you can do it. All 4 questions all together, and then we'll answer.
You're just going to take a note there.
Yes.
Just ask one question, then I'll be able to remember them. Okay.
I got.
Okay.
Perfect. Thanks, Carla.
Sorry.
She knows my age.
What I'd like to ask is, this doesn't have to really, this has not to do with the policies on women's states. This is just more of a general question that I'm just feeling a bit curious about. Streaming in schools. I seem to have a bit of a problem with that. And you said you've worked for the Ministry of Education, right?
Yeah.
Do you agree with it? Do you think it's a...
So I'll come back. I'm going to answer all the questions at the end. You're concerned about streaming, and you're concerned about kids of color and kids from poverty being streamed into certain... okay, I'll come back to that. Yeah.
Good evening. Thank you for taking my question. I basically wanted to ask an economic question. I'm going to India to a women's economic forum, And I was very happy to hear what you had mentioned about forging relationships with clean and green technology. And it's, I think, one of the areas, technology, that is really closing the gender gap, because of it's a great way to earn a wage, and I think it's a very viable industry that's going to really push forward. So I think it's a great area for women. So I just wondered if you could expand on if you're considering giving any tax credits and forging relationships with businesses to bring them to Canada, because I think it would be a super industry for women to get into, in technology and healthcare, and there's so many applications. Thank you very much.
Okay, great, thank you.
Hi, I come from the second poorest riding in Ontario, which is York Southwestern, but we have a great deal of optimism about what can happen. And I would like to see, if you don't mind, more of a push on what's going well and the new innovations that are made. For example, there was one right now where they have these people who were recycling used cardboard, and they were making these little things you could put all your scraps in and just throw it right in the garden. You didn't have to throw it in the landfill or anything. And lo and behold, they got a call from Australia, and they said, hey, you know what? We have a problem with dengue fever. We're wondering, can you work with us on something? And they've got something that everybody in the world is clamoring for now, and it's called an insect trap for the mosquitoes. And it's this kind of thing that we really need. Australia also has a program on its national radio called Innovations, and it talks about stuff that Australia is doing and how they're handling it all over the world. And I think we should have something like that, not only in Ontario, but for Canada. And could we possibly start putting a positive slant? We hear so much about what's wrong and what's going bad. I'm sure you're sick of it too. But I would like to say that...
That right, sister.
I would like to see us, say this is positive and get our First Nations people involved in the new, exciting things that are happening. There's so much technology we can put to use. There's so many things we can do.
I'll come back. I've got a couple of comments I want to make on that at the end. So we're going to have one more question. Thank you for that.
Hello, Kathleen. Janice Kyle. I volunteered on your campaign, so it's a great honor to speak to you again.
Great to see you.
And I live now in Peterborough, and we are lucky to have the Minister of Agriculture and Rural Affairs in our riding. So my question is specifically about the gap that exists between rural and urban Ontario. Mm-hmm. And if there can be greater cohesion between rural women and urban women, and how would we go about that? Because it's very clear to me that that urban Ontario does not really understand rural Ontario, in particular the agricultural sector, where women are very, very predominant. Yes. And so what can we do about that? Thanks so much.
That's a great question. So I've got 4 great questions here. I'm just going to go through them quickly, and then I know we have to wrap up. So maybe I'll start with the streaming question. Some of you who have been in education for a while will remember that decades ago we had a big debate about streaming and de-streaming in Ontario. And in fact, there was a push to de-stream the education system. And I think that the debate is coming up again, because we are still seeing that there are certain groups of kids who are not achieving at the level of other kids, and that is a challenge, and it's a problem from my perspective. If you look at Liz Sandals, our Minister of Education, look at her mandate letter from me, you will see in it that I have asked her to focus on strategies that actually would recognize that there are certain groups of kids. So Aboriginal kids, kids of color, kids with special needs, kids in care. There are groups of students who do not do as well. And so we are working on strategies to address some of those things. We're not there. There is some sign that is changing a bit. But just so everyone is clear, there is no institutional streaming in the Ontario education system. What happens is there are particular groups of kids who end up taking certain courses for a variety of reasons, and we haven't sorted out how to prevent some of that differentiation. but it's not institutionalized, and it's not anything that we think is acceptable. Women's Economic Forum and Women in Technology. One of the questions I have about women in technology is when I go into some of the startup centers and I see the young people who are involved in a lot of the technological innovation, I worry that there aren't as many women as there are men. That is actually a concern of mine, because there are tax credits in place. There are supports for startup and scaling up companies. We've made that a real focus of our government. But it is a conversation I've had with groups of young men in technology about what is it about technology that doesn't draw as many women as it should. And that's related to the conversation about STEM, so the science, technology, engineering, and math courses, where we see women leaving at a greater rate than young men. So if anybody has answers on that, I would love to hear that, because we have made a focus on technology, and we need to figure out how to get more women into it. New innovations, I love the idea of focusing on good things are happening. We just need to get the media to report on good stuff.
Got it.
Jane's making a note here. We humans love conflict, and so the media reports on conflict, reports where there's a problem, because that's what sells papers, sells media, sells radio spots, sells social media. So I don't know the answer to that, except that I think that we do need to, as a society, tell each other the good stuff, because there is so much good going on. Every time I go into a high school or into a college and I see what is happening, the young minds that are at work, it's just phenomenal. So I couldn't agree more about that. Rural and urban Ontario, I think there's a degree to which there is a rift. I also think there's a degree to which we make more of it than we should, and that we should, again, talk about the similarities and not just the differences. But I just want you to know that Jeff Leal, who is your member, I don't know if you're still out there, but Jeff Leal, who is your member, raises this issue. Maria van Bommel, who was previously our member, she made a very clear, she was a very clear voice about the importance of the voices of rural women. One of the challenges that I know we face in rural Ontario, if we look at the face of rural poverty as opposed to the face of urban poverty, you see isolation, physical isolation in rural communities in a different way than physical isolation in urban communities. Of course, we have isolation in our urban centers, but the vulnerability of rural women who are living in poverty is quite graphic. So one of the things, for example, I'll end on this. We're trying to work to provide transportation options for women in rural communities. Getting the regulations changed around school buses, for example, so that there can be those vehicles that are making, are doing a route at a certain time of day could actually pick up some women and take them to appointments or take them into town. We've been sort of hidebound by regulation on some of these things in the past, but having those small community transportation solutions, putting some money into that, would be something that would actually address a problem that rural women talk about, because transportation can be a huge concern. So, we know that there are those kinds of issues that we need to address, so we're not oblivious to those concerns. Thank you, everybody, so much for being here. Thank you.